some point in a little bit and maybe have questions and then do a little bit more after. That's okay?
Yeah, just give me 2 minutes to introduce you.
Absolutely.
To the audience. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Welcome to the second talk of the series of distinguished lectures by women scientists working on climate science and policy by the Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies at IIT Bombay as part of our celebrations of completion of 10 years of the program. Shiba, are we going to record this session?
Yes, I'm recording it.
All right. My name is Arpita and I am a part of the climate studies faculty, and I am to introduce Professor Basu today, and I apologize that it will be a bit personal. I will begin by taking you to a few years back when I had accidentally bumped into a distinguished lecture video in YouTube by a very dynamic professor who spoke with so much passion about her work that even though the topic of the talk was tangential to my research, I was glued from the first to the last minute. Then I started stalking her, academically, of course, and was pleasantly surprised to find that she also graduated in civil engineering from Jadavpur University, my alma mater, and also that of Professor Shubhimal Ghosh. Therefore, this is kind of a fangirling moment for me to introduce Professor Nandita Basu to you today. Professor Basu is a professor and Canada Research Chair of Global Water Sustainability and Eco-Hydrology and the Director of the Collaborative Water Program at the University of Waterloo. She is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Hydrology. She's an environmental engineer who uses data science, process modeling, and remote sensing to explore how climate, land use, and management impacts surface and groundwater quality across agricultural, urban, and forested landscapes, and from watershed to the regional and global scales. If I'm not wrong, Professor Basu is one of the first civil engineers to serve in the board of reviewing editors for Science magazine. She also champions the cause of inclusivity in STEM, and many of her mentoring talks, available in YouTube again, have personally helped me navigate academic waters. And last but not the least, along with being an accomplished scientist and a global thought leader, Professor Basu is an example of a compassionate parent of a young child in terms of methods of creating STEM awareness and love for nature from a very early age. Today, she will talk to us about water quality challenges and opportunities from the local to the global scale. Over to you, Professor Basu.
Thank you so much, Arpita. That is one of the best introductions that I've ever heard. Thank you. I'm really deeply honored. Speaking of little ones, so my 8-year-old has been given iPad this morning before, so I don't think he will come in, but just a caveat before I start talking. It's funny because he never wakes up at 7 a.m., but today he wanted to wake up so he could get to watch iPad for an hour. Thank you again. Really deeply honored to be virtually talking to you today. I like Orpita. Twitter is an interesting world where you get to know each other without meeting in person. So really have enjoyed your tweets too, as well as the music and everything. It's been an honor following your life a little bit also.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
I should say here that your name was proposed by Shubhimal, and he also shared very proudly in our civil engineering faculty list, like look, here is a civil engineer who is in the board of reviewing editors for Science, and it was purely his idea to have you for the series.
Thank you. No, and I have heard of so I came across you, Orpita, but I'd heard about Shubhimal before from others and I've been, so one of the things that I do want to do next time I visit India is to maybe be able to go to Mumbai. It's you have an amazing group there, so it's really cool to we'll be able to meet you in person. So jumping right in. So the title of my talk is Water Quality Challenges and Opportunities from the Local to the Global Scales. I'll talk primarily about water quality. But as I was pulling my talk together yesterday, I'm very much a last minute person. I felt I did want to talk because there is a lot of interest from what I saw in the faculty there in more kind of hydrology, water quantity, statistical hydrology space. I'll talk a little bit of one of our recent work there too. Jumping in, yeah. So talking about the research in our group, this is an infographic that was made by one of my very talented PhDs, Tyler Hampton. And I like it because I always, our research spans a really broad suit of things, broadly ecohydrology. I am, as a scientist, I really like exploring a wide range of research questions. I think the basic theme that runs through our research is the idea of the Anthropocene. So humans and how they interact with the water systems and how that interaction impacts the way we manage our water resources and how to sustainably manage it. So Tyler's project, for example, is forest fire and water quality. I will not talk about that today. A lot of our work is on agricultural systems and water quality because, of course, agriculture is one of the biggest water quality influencers on the landscape. We also work on some urban systems and more global hydrology and water quality issues. Of course, science is more about the people that do the science than scientific progress in my world. A lot of times, one of the things that I always tell my student is, it's not the papers, but you are the product of the PhD. So it's important to kind of both thank them, but also they are the people that energize the research. And I have been really fortunate to have an amazing group of people over the years in our lab. A lot of the research in our group kind of sits in this first circle, diagnosing and modeling various water resources challenges. But in the recent past, I've gotten more and more interested in the space of solutions. And this is where I feel more the science part of my brain connects with the engineering part of my brain. How do we think about solutions that address multiple sustainable development goals? So in today's talk, I'll talk a little bit towards the end about how we are thinking about some of these solution spaces. And that was actually inspired by, long time back, I was talking to this one person, and I do a lot of work on water pollution. And this person commented to me, well, whatever you say is so depressing. And I realized that the perspective needs to change. And as scientists, I as a scientist, I would say as a scientist, I really wanted to enter into the space about not just saying, hey, world's falling apart, climate is changing, but to say what are the things that we can do about it, and where are those levers in the landscape to make a change happen. So that's where one of the places where I see some of our current work going. Okay, so as I said, I was going to start it by presenting not a water quality, but a hydrology piece of work that we did. And this is work that was kind of motivated by this paper that came out in PNAS. And kind of broadly speaking, there's this big question that is in the space of hydrology, that when we see a change in the landscape, is it climate or is it water management or human impact? And the problem with answering this question, of course, is that it is both, but it's tough to tease out the differential effect of one versus the other. And that is a challenge because that leads to kind of gridlocks in the way we manage water systems. So this paper that came out in PNAS talked about the fact that they found that climate was the primary driver, and human water management really did not have much of an effect on the changes that we see. So that was the motivation for our work. And this is work that was done by a postdoc in the lab, Nitin Singh. And we asked the question, what is the human? Can we tease out the human factor? We used a similar set of data set to the other papers, but one of the key differences in how we were analyzing the data was, instead of looking at annual trends, we broke up our trends into these seasonal trends. And one of the reasons of that is because some of our data analysis highlighted that a lot of times the annual trends kind of mask everything. So you really want to be looking at seasons to see stuff. So what you see over here on the left is every point is a watershed, and in this case, these watersheds are both natural, so pristine forested watersheds, as well as human managed watersheds. And what you see is a trend. So there's in this data set, there's about 300 natural watershed and 1900 managed watersheds. And what you see is a 40-year trend in flow. The blues are where flows are increasing, so it's getting wetter, and the reds, which is in the western part, where it's getting drier. So we see this pattern where the eastern part and the Midwest are getting wetter and the West is getting drier. So now the question that we wanted to ask is there a difference in these trends between pristine watersheds, natural watersheds, and managed watersheds? And so the way we went about doing that is by taking natural watersheds and drawing a 100-kilometer circle around it. And of course, there's assumptions to that without a doubt. But what we said was that within that 100-kilometer radius of the natural watershed, the managed watersheds in that radius had the same climate signal. So if you saw a change in a natural watershed but did not see a change in the managed watershed, then that is an indication of human management effect. And what we looked at was just linear sense slopes, and we calculated the slopes of the natural and managed watersheds. And we can have multiple versions of this, right? So both natural and managed watershed can be increasing in trends, and always in the rest of this set of talks, increase means blue. So both of them can have flow increase. Both of them can show a flow decrease, as in red. It can be an opposite pattern. So managed can be a decrease and natural can be an increase, and then vice versa. Now, I'm not going to go into the last two rows where you have opposite trends. There are some watersheds where we saw an opposite trend, but the percent of them was relatively low, I think about 10% or so. So I'll focus on the similar direction trends. And the other aspect of this is the ratio of the trends, right? So even when they are happening in the same direction, what is the ratio of the managed watershed trends versus natural? And of course, there is a lot of managed watersheds within the natural circle, so there's variability within it. So do we look at it statistically? Now, jumping into the results. So there's a lot going on here, and I'll try to walk you through it. What you see now in these circles is only managed watersheds. And what you see over here is that the blue colors mean that, again, both natural and managed watersheds flows are increasing, and red means flows are decreasing. Now, the other part of it is when you look at our classes of 4 and 5. So let's just focus on the blue here, the kind of cyan blue and the deep blue. Those are two sets of watersheds where human influence is amplifying flows. What that means is that if you take a managed natural watershed and if you take a managed watershed in its neighborhood, you see a 20% to 167%, or sometimes with the deep blue, more than 167% amplification in the flow in the managed watershed compared to the human watershed, natural watershed in its neighborhood. So this amplification of flow is an indication of maybe some flooding that's happening due to urban areas and managed watersheds that you're not seeing in their pristine natural systems. So what we are saying is both natural and managed watershed flows are increasing, but in the managed watershed, flows are increasing at a faster rate. And of course, these patterns vary with season. And one of the things that we found is that winter and fall, we see greater trends. Spring, a lot of non-significant trends exist. Okay. So the next part of it is what about the reds? And in the reds, we also found example of managed watersheds. So in this case, the deep red and the maroons are colors where human influence is amplifying decreasing trends. What that means is if the natural watershed shows a decrease in the flow, then the managed watershed shows a faster decrease in flow. And again, this in the arid West, that might be happening because you are are doing water withdrawals, there's human water use. So the water management is taking away a lot of water at a faster rate. So this is an indication of drought. So to summarize that part of the work, what we are seeing is this metric of flow alteration, right? And we can have RPP, which means both natural and managed watershed has increasing trends in flow. And we can have RNN, which is both decreasing trends in flow. Within that, when we see an amplification, which means there is flooding, we can also see amplification in the red domain, and this is when you're threatening water security, you're decreasing environmental flows, and this is because you're losing water at a faster rate than a natural watershed. Similarly, we can also see a dampening effect. So a dampening effect is where when you're looking on in the red color, these are the classes 1 and 2. So the light creamish to light orangish color. And this is where human influence is dampening the extremities of the flow. And this can be a reservoir that's managing the flow effectively. So here human impact is buffering low flows. And also on the with the blues, you can see that there is this lighter bluish color where humans are dampening also higher flows. And again, that can be reservoirs holding the water back. So to summarize, so dampening higher flows can be buffering extreme events, dampening lower flows can be droughts. So after we did this, the next thing we wanted to do is kind of really hone in on whether humans were really causing a change that was at a rate greater than in natural watersheds. I'm not going to go into methodology. What we did was we developed a random forest model to describe these trends. And what you see over here on the x-axis is the variables in the random forest model that came out as most important. So this row is only for the natural watersheds. And for the natural watersheds, we find that as you would expect, the seasonal precipitation, the season, the slope, the forest cover, the drainage area, those were the most important variables. However, if you went to the managed watershed, season was still important, but canal density, impervious area, storage SS, dam water storage, those became much more important variables in the random forest model. So to summarize, what we saw in contrast to that other PNAS paper is that humans were modifying flows in a really significant way across the landscape, which provides indication that, again, we can do better in terms of managing the flow where we see buffering. That's what we want to achieve. And where we see that humans are really magnifying flow a lot, that creates a cause for concern. So our paper was actually picked up by USA Today, which was really cool, and we got to be on the same page as Obama's picture. That will be the highlight of our lives. But the main point being that human activity can both worsen droughts and flooding across the landscape. Okay, so this was a little bit of a detour of some of our work in the space of hydrology, and I wanted to pause to see if there's any questions.
No, we don't see any raised hands. Let's continue.
Okay, sure. I'll move forward. Okay, so I'm going to jump from hydrology to water quality, and this is where a lot of our group's research focuses on. Water quality is, of course, one of the really, really important pieces of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a part of clean water and sanitation, but it is linked to pretty much most of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you just pick one, zero hunger requires us to grow food. Food requires application of fertilizers, which impact our water quality. So water quality is a key part to meeting a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals. And water quality has been improving at a global scale. So if you think about diarrheal deaths per 100,000 of the population, we've gotten better in terms of water quality, but better a lot in North America and Europe, but globally, if you think about water quality impacts, there is significant water quality challenges, both from water-related diseases. And over 80% of the world's wastewater is discharged back into rivers and streams, causing significant water quality problems. Coming back to the US with water quality, this is an example of the Cuyahoga River in the US Midwest that used to burn regularly in the 1970s. And this prompted the Clean Water Act, which really impacted how the industry was regulated. And today, the Cuyahoga River looks like that. So in terms of positive water quality stories, that is definitely a positive story. However, there's also still now significant water quality problems related to algal blooms. And of course, if you look in different parts of the world, so this is from Bangalore, which is the Jalandhar Lake in Bangalore, where you have these toxic plumes. So globally, there is still significant water quality challenges, both from industrial pollution as well as domestic waste. Globally, water quality risks are ubiquitous. I like pointing to this article, this book on Quality Unknown, the Invisible Water Quality Crisis. There's a ton of work on water quantity challenges and the fact that we are running out of water, but the water quality part of it is a lot of times hidden, and it impacts us really significantly. And with a changing climate, with changing precipitation, this is going to get worse over the next decade. Of course, a lot of our group focuses on the question of algal blooms. So these are the green muck that you see in our lakes and coastal areas. And they cause hypoxia, which is low oxygen conditions in the water, impact the economy in terms of fisheries. They also have other impact in terms of drinking water, because some of these algae produce toxins, and you get toxic algal blooms that can shut drinking water plants off. Algal blooms globally have been increasing in the last decade or so, and that is both from increased pollution, but also from a warming climate, which creates an ideal atmosphere for the algae to bloom, as well as more intense precipitation events that lead to more runoff from our agricultural and urban areas into our lake and water bodies that promote these blooms. Water quality is just not a groundwater problem. It's a surface water problem. It is also a groundwater problem. So nitrate in drinking water has been increasing, both globally. This is US data. And one of the challenges with nitrate in drinking water, of course, is though our World Health Organization limits at 10 milligram per liter, there is evidence that says that you can have pancreatic cancer even below that. So it is a significant source of concern. So with all of these water quality challenges, there's been significant investment in North America and Europe in addressing these challenges, billions of dollars spent on various watershed intervention to reduce agricultural pollution. A lot of these water quality challenges are driven by fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural areas. And what I'm showing on the left-hand side over here is the fact that despite a lot of these different programs, this is the Chesapeake in the US, Baltic Sea in Europe, the bars, which are the nutrient loads and the hypoxic areas, have not changed that much over the last 30 years. And so this is kind of the basis for a lot of the research, where one of our hypotheses is one of the reasons behind that is legacies of pollutants. The idea of legacy is that we've been putting fertilizers on the landscape for 20, 30 years, and these fertilizers have accumulated in these landscapes as these internal memories or legacies. So when you make a change to the landscape, so let's say you decrease fertilizer application, you'll have to get rid of these internal memories or legacies before you will see an impact in water quality. And this is one of the big challenges in the present day water quality, because we don't understand legacies, we can't quantify it well, and people think about them as an excuse, because you're putting in money and nothing's happening, so maybe you're not doing it right. So this is kind of the motivation of this paper that we did, which is how do we think of legacy? So the first part, and so in this paper, we talked about this roadmap of thinking about legacies in the landscape. The first part of it is, of course, the most obvious. If you want to address a problem, you actually address it head on, quantify legacies and lag times. And that seems like kind of trivial and obvious, but in the world of policymaking, so when I started working on it 10 years ago, one of the things that I was told most commonly is do not talk about legacies. If you tell people that it will take 10 years to make a change, politicians are not going to invest in money for a change. And part of the challenge with that rhetoric is if we do not say that it will take some time, when changes are made and water quality doesn't improve, that leads to disillusionment, that leads to people disbelieving science. So we really need to tackle it head on and quantify these legacies and time lags. So kind of breaking that into some simple pieces, right? How do we quantify legacies? So um, I like thinking about these things as boxes and arrows. So if you think about legacies, the first part of it is stores. How much is in the landscape, what form or where? So if you think about nitrogen, there's legacies in the soil. And there's also dissolved nitrogen in the groundwater. So there's legacies in the groundwater. If you think about phosphorus, you also have legacies that are in the sediments in the reservoir. So really need to figure out where these legacies are and using various data driven techniques to do that. And then the next part of the question is, how are these legacies mobilized? And this is where a changing climate and precipitation come into fact, because if you have a lot of legacies in the landscapes, then a changing climate will mobilize these legacies down into your water bodies. So a lot of the work in our research group focuses on quantifying these legacies. And this is what, as a civil engineer or as an environmental engineer, I was definitely not trained to do. And one of the things that I want to share with students over here, to me, science is about you pursue a question and you master the techniques that you need to master, and doesn't matter what you were trained in. So in this case, we learned how to study a lot of agricultural databases, a lot of cow counting, to understand what are the inputs over the landscape. So in this image that you see on the left, we have quantified phosphorus input over the last century across the landscape. And the major form of the input in this particular watershed is manure phosphorus, and then there is fertilizer. And then the output in this case is crop uptake. What you see in the black line over there is the phosphorus surplus in the landscape. So this is the phosphorus that remains there in the landscape. And one of the things that you see is that it did peak in the 1980s. So that means we've gotten better at using the phosphorus effectively that we apply. But all that phosphorus that's under that black line is still sitting in the landscape. So even if you apply less fertilizer, that phosphorus is still going to come out in your rivers and cause algal bloom. So that's the most important thing to remember. And we've kind of done this across US. Right now, we are doing it in Canada, and we are actually also doing it at the global scale. So building these databases of nitrogen and phosphorus input, this is done at the county scale across continental US. The red areas means inputs are more, and you see that over time inputs increase. So what is this idea of legacy? What do we mean by it? So I'm going to try to explain this using this graph. So on the x-axis, you see net nitrogen input. So this is the nitrogen that you're adding to the landscape. And I don't know the background of this team, but the idea is that you add the nitrogen to the landscape, to a watershed, and what you're measuring out in the river is the nitrogen load. So this is how much kilogram of nitrogen is coming in the stream water per year. Each of this color is a different watershed, and it's an average value for that watershed. And so what you see is this linear relationship where you're saying that 27% of the nitrogen input is coming out as nitrogen load in the river. And this is what people have used for a long time. This is established relationship. And if you look at this relationship, what you would think is the solution to our problem of algal blooms is let's just reduce input. So if you go in this figure from the right to the left, so along that line, if you decrease the nitrogen inputs, your nitrogen load would decrease. Now, if you wanted to take this a step further, let's take one of these circles and expand that circle in time. Right, so this is the same x and the y axis, but now the x axis is net nitrogen inputs, the y axis is nitrogen load, but this is just one watershed. And you see that the relationship is not linear anymore. You see these beautiful hysteretic patterns. What that means is for the same nitrogen inputs, your nitrogen loads were lower earlier but are higher now, and that is because of these memory within the landscape that's bleeding out older nitrogen into your system. And because of that, when you reduce inputs, you will not see a concomitant decrease in outputs. And these relationships vary across different watersheds. So this is a catchment in Denmark where you see a beautiful linear relationship. So in this catchment, if you decreased inputs, it would be okay. So we're now studying this for multiple watersheds across US, and you see different kinds of relationship. You see a mix of clockwise loops and anti-clockwise loops. Clockwise loops, anti-clockwise loops are ones in which you have a memory effect. Clockwise loops are where they respond faster. And we're trying to get at understanding when and why do you see these behavior. So I'm going to jump topics right now and talk a little bit about modeling these systems, right? So this is just data. So we developed this model called element model. And the idea of this model is to really quantify these legacies in the landscape. I'm not going to go into details of these models, but we've used these models to model trajectories of land use over the Mississippi River Basin and Susquehanna River Basin. And one of these things that these models tell us is how long will it take for the water quality to improve. So in this case, we find that if you want to achieve a certain reduction in nutrient loads, it will take about 35 years for that water quality to improve. So that is kind of the main goal of a whole lot of our work, to say how long it will take for the water quality to improve. We've also developed this model. That one was for nitrogen. We've also developed it for phosphorus in these landscapes. And again, in this case with phosphorus, we say, well, when you're adding phosphorus to the landscape, a lot of it stays in the soils. And in this case, we say since 1900, only 4% of the phosphorus inputs have showed up at the outlet of this watershed. The rest of it, 96%, is staying in the landscape. So you really need to think about that 96%. We can also use these models, of course, to predict forward in time. And in this case, our model showed that reducing manure losses would lead to the fastest improvements in water quality. Okay, so I wanted to hone in on that idea of the fact that a lot of these nutrients are staying there in the landscape as legacy nutrients. And this is where we flip on to thinking about the problem, to thinking about solutions to the problem. And in this case, we're thinking about the fact that if indeed these legacies are building up in the landscape, can we effectively think about them as a resource? And indeed, a lot of work has been done in plot scale studies that attribute the fact that a lot of the nitrogen, for example, that is taken up by crop is not this year's fertilizer, but nitrogen from last year or the year before. And plot scale studies also show that you can reduce both nitrogen and phosphorus application. Your crop production doesn't change that much, but water quality will improve. So there is scope for improvement. What is requires is more policy and structural changes for it to happen. The other pieces of these puzzle is we have to think about these measures as spatially targeted because it can get really expensive. You have to diversify monitoring to find evidence of success. And you have to think about both short and long-term measures. I'm not going to talk about all the pieces over here. I wanted to hone in on this idea of spatial targeting and short and long-term measures. What do I mean by that? So let's think about nitrogen. So nitrogen is dissolved in groundwater, and you have legacy nitrogen in groundwater. So if you have legacy nitrogen in groundwater, there is nothing that you can do in terms of applying less fertilizer that's going to impact it, because it's like the horse that has left the barn. It's already there in the groundwater. So the only way to address it is having wetlands or downstream wetlands that can intercept that water. So this is where I'll talk to you a little bit about our wetland work. Of course, we know that wetlands retain excess nutrients and improve water quality. And I could not do this talk without talking a little bit about one of my first wetland loves. So this is my first undergraduate project that I did with Professor Shibna Chakraborty at Jadavpur, where I worked on the Kolkata wetlands. And I was fascinated by the system of wetlands, where it serves as the kidneys of the city. It literally served as the kidneys of the city, and also there was this vibrant aquaculture system that supported it. So I remember I was just really in love with my project. And then I kind of went away from my love for wetlands, because, you know, when you start get into a PhD, you sometimes get into directions that you didn't know. So I'm really glad having come back to thinking about wetlands. But this I find one of the most amazing wetland systems to think about. I always talk about it. So coming back to thinking about wetlands, there's a lot of work that has been done on wetlands. And one of the spaces that we wanted to ask a question was kind of in this question of scale, right? So here we defined a wetlandscape as a landscape with zillions of wetlands. And we asked the question, what is the role of that wetlandscape in purifying our water? And this question was actually motivated by a conversation with a Department of Natural Resources in US when I was there, where they asked me a simple question. They said, well, we have money for wetland restoration. Which wetland should we restore? And I realized I had no idea. I knew wetlands were good, but I had no idea. And this is what prompted this line of work. So what Fred did in this first piece of the work is that he took data from hundreds of wetlands across the world and analyzed the removal rates in these wetlands. Of course, the data is completely biased towards North America and Europe. We're doing something that I think is really interesting now, where I have a student from China who's actually got a whole bunch of Chinese wetlands, which were not in the English language literature, to populate this database, but that's a different story. So we use that to estimate nitrogen removal rates in these wetlands. I'm not going to bother you with a lot of details, but one of the things that we found was really interesting is that small wetlands are more effective at removing nutrients than larger wetlands. And that's because small wetlands have a lot of contact with sediments, and it's the sediments where the reaction happens. So what that means is 10 1-hectare wetlands are actually better than 1 10-hectare wetland. Anyway, so with all of those, we developed a really simplified model. And using that model, we said, how much nitrogen is removed by wetlands across the continental US? Really simple question. And this is a question that started in coffee shops at San Francisco American Geophysical Union meeting, which is one of the places that science always does best, coffee shops. So we took national wetland inventory data, coupled it with some of our models of nitrogen removal that we developed with Fred's data set. And we came up with an estimate of % nitrogen removal by wetlands in each watershed. So these are HUC 8 watersheds, HUC 12 watersheds across US. And what you see over here is that map really mimics the wetland density map. So when you have high wetlands, you have high potential removal by wetlands. However, potential removal is different than actual removal. Actual removal is a function of where the pollution is. And to do that, we then wanted to link sinks with sources. So sources are where the nitrogen is. And this is the other part of our research work, where we have nitrogen inputs in the landscape. So the redder areas means more nitrogen inputs. And we use these to estimate the total nitrogen removal by wetlands across US. And we got this number. What does it mean? What it means is that without existing wetlands, nitrogen loads in the Mississippi River Basin would be 50% higher than they are now. So that's important because that says a lot about how valuable these wetlands are. Double the nitrogen load is quite a large amount. The other thing that we found is that there was a spatial disconnect, and you can kind of see that in those two maps. Where the wetlands are is not where the nitrogen is. And if you want wetlands to remove nitrogen from the water, you need to put them where the nitrogen is. So the spatial decoupling is what you're seeing in this landscape. So the red areas are where you have a lot of nitrogen, but you don't have wetlands. So we asked the question, how can wetland restoration contribute to improvements in water quality? We did these simulations. So this is a case of random wetland restoration. So in this case, we are saying randomly across the entire country, we will restore wetlands. We did another set of simulations where we said no agricultural land loss. And finally, we preferentially restored wetlands in areas that had a lot of agricultural land. And we found that, of course, so here you see, this is line of 10% increase in wetland area, and you get a lot more benefit if you have targeted restoration. You get 40 times more nitrogen removal than under non-targeted restoration. And of course, it comes at an extra cost because you are putting in wetlands in these high value farmlands. But the cost is not as significant. So the cost is only double the cost. So targeted restoration has a lot more value than the cost of it. So the reason this is important is in our urban and agricultural areas, we lose a lot of wetlands. So the Greater Toronto area is the area that we live in. It's an area that's really one of the fastest growing areas. And we are constantly fighting about keeping some of the existing urban and agricultural wetlands alive, not having them paved over by some facility. And one of the reasons being that they are degraded and people don't recognize the quality and the value they provide. And again, bringing us back to the East Kolkata wetlands, which a lot of it has been lost even since the time I studied it. And our lack of recognition of how much value these water bodies provide is really something that we need to focus on. This is more recent work Emily Urey is doing on building on this work for phosphorus. Of course, wetlands also sequester carbon and provide other ecosystem services. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, that's my research group. That's Fred, who I presented a lot of work, his graduation cake. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, sorry about the lack of clarity in that image, a recent project that got funded. And this is kind of entering into the space of thinking about solutions to challenges. And in this case, we are thinking about wetland protection, manure to bioenergy, which we haven't talked about, and farm conservation as practices that address both climate challenges because they're nature-based solutions to climate change, but they also address water challenges. And we are developing these methodologies kind of similar to what you saw with the wetland work to say, how can we develop these maps to say what kinds of solutions would be viable? What are possible pathways of investing money in some of these solutions to climate and water quality? So it involves a lot of data analysis and model development and working with stakeholders around here to develop these maps and spatial optimization techniques. If there's any interest in it, I'd love to talk more. And with that, I would love some questions. And thank you again for the invite.
Thank you very much, Professor Basu. That was a fascinating talk, as always. I think we can start taking questions now, Shiva, right?
Yeah, so Tejasvi has already raised his hand. Tejasvi?
Wait, hold on.
Should I stop sharing? Quick question. Should I stop sharing so we can see faces? And then if I need to, I can try sharing again.
Yes.
Okay.
That's good.
Tejasvi?
Before opening up for Tejasvi, just one very minor question. Is the legacy terminology determined by your group, or was it a conventional term?
So legacy is not, so I should have said that legacy is not a new term. So people have talked about legacy phosphorus for a long time. It has, so for legacy phosphorus, it has been well known that legacy is a big challenge. For legacy nitrogen, it was somewhat in our group because so we know that nitrogen accumulates in our groundwater, but what our group found was that there's also legacy nitrogen in the soil that is much larger in magnitude than the groundwater. But the broader legacy concept was known. What our group has been developing is models to describe it. Generally, the way people have mostly thought about legacy is, oh, it's a really challenging problem, and it will delay, but not to really think about how do we quantify those delays and how do we develop models about those delays. So that's kind of more the contribution. Thank you so much, Arpita, for the question.
Thanks. Tejasvi, go ahead. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Nandita. Thank you for this presentation. I have two questions. I'm a student of Professor Subimal Ghosh. I'm a PhD student here at IIT Bombay. So my first question is, through your talk, I realized how much potential each and every means, how much potential do plants carry when we talk about removal of nutrients, or removal of pollutants from the soil. But do these models or do these techniques take into consideration the performance of a plant, how the performance of a plant goes down as pollutants increase? Because I'm working on mangroves currently, and what I've read is that there is an ideal ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus of 16. And if it deviates from that, performance declines. So kind of photosynthetic performance declines. So in a scenario when these nutrient or these configuration of these nutrients are already high, already towards the worst side, do these models consider the exponential increase in performance or exponential decay of performance as the nutrients are readjusted?
So really good question, Tejasvi. So yes, I mean, one of the key pieces that I think depends on the modeling framework you're talking about, a lot of times is missing is the vegetation part of it. And that's one of the key pieces. In fact, I haven't talked about it. The forest work that we are doing is exactly that, incorporating forest growth in hydrology models. So I think that vegetation is a really, really important part. In our models, one of the things that we do is we actually use crop yield data, so crop productivity data, which is available from agricultural census databases. So you can go in and say what is the yield of crops because that's recorded. So we use that data, and through that we can actually quantify those. So what we put in our models, and I didn't go into details of it, we have fertilizer coming in, but then the crop productivity in the later decade, for example, in our case, it's because of more advanced crop varieties that have come in play. Crop productivity has increased, so that is taken into account in that balance. But I would definitely agree that that is an important component and needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Coming to my second question, it is regarding my work, not means I have a doubt regarding what I'm doing right now. So I'm working on Sundarban mangroves right now. So these are the one of the very prominent biodiversity hotspots, and we have data from two sites, actually observed data from Sundarbans mangroves. And what I've found is that nitrogen to phosphorus ratio has significantly shot up in a span of, let's say, 3 years. So it went from 16, or means the ideal ratio, to around 150. So what should it mean to such a thing? Means what should it mean for health of Sundarbans, or let's say nutrient removal, or how should I interpret this at a larger scale?
That is a really interesting question, Tejasvi. I'm really keen to talk to you more about it. I'll tell you. So there's, and I can, if you send me an email, I can send you a body of papers. It's actually not that long ago when in one of our papers, when we were looking at NP ratios, and I haven't talked about this, I did a little bit deep dive into NP ratios. And one of the things globally that has been seen is as a region becomes more developed and pollution increases, NP ratios increase. And the reason NP ratios increase is because phosphorus gets absorbed to the soil more. whereas nitrogen is very mobile. So a signal of development is an increase in NP ratios. So it's interesting that you're also seeing that signal in the Sundarbans. It's a pretty consistent signal. People have seen it in many places, that development leads to increase in NP ratios. And there's this person, Pat Gleibert, who's done a lot of work on what also that means in terms of water quality. And one of the things that she talks about, though there's a lot of it's an area that people are doing a lot of research on. There's a lot of uncertainties too, but she talks about the fact that there has been evidence that says higher NP ratios lead to more harmful blooms, so more toxin producing algal blooms, for multiple reasons. So higher NP ratios has multiple impacts.
Great. Thank you so much.
And if you send me an email, her work is, I would say, probably one of the most comprehensive. And there's if you start with hers, there's so if you send me an email, I'll forward you some of her papers.
Thank you so much. At some point, I'd like to discuss this with you more also. So I'll send you an email.
Absolutely. And there is also, so I'll tell you another thing. So not my work, I do not do any work on mangroves, but there is one, I have a student whose committee I'm on, and the student is guided by a professor in our Faculty of Environment, Pradeep Nayak, and she's also working on mangroves in the Chilka and I'm on her committee. So if you are interested, I can connect you with her too, because I think that might be an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. So who knows, we can start collaborations through webinars and not just through AGU. Okay, we have questions from Karthik. You can unmute yourself.
Ma'am.
Can you turn on your camera, please?
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
So I'm Karthik Jadhav. So I'm from IIT Roorkee. I'm currently pursuing my PhD under Professor Basant in I'm in first year. So I have one question. You talk lot about nitrogen and phosphorus, but as I read in some article that apart from nitrogen and phosphorus, some heavy metals are also accumulating over the time from using of agrochemicals. So do you have any idea about how under changing climate such heavy metals are impacting to the ground particularly?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, legacies are for pretty much every pollutant that you can think about, right? So we focus primarily on nitrogen and phosphorus, but heavy metals, pesticides, I mean, everything. There's legacy issues with everything. And one of the things with a changing climate that it is happening will be happening to all of them is when you have a changing climate, your water level changes. When your water level changes, your redox condition change. And when your redox change, something that was not mobile suddenly becomes mobile. So the same principles, and we see that with phosphorus. So the same principles are, I think, valid for whatever pollutant you can think about. And again, I think I mean, people have talked about legacies of metals, definitely, heavy metals, definitely, and yeah. But we don't do any work on them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. Maya, you can also unmute yourself, turn on your camera.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the talk. Could you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So, ma'am, I wanted to ask, like, so when we talk about wetlands, so Mumbai has some wetlands, and even Kolkata has some wetlands. So what could be the starting points of these wetlands, like how they help in the environment, and we don't have much data also for these wetlands. So how do we start, like, researching these wetlands, and how it help our water quality, and how can it can help in urban water drinking, even for the betterment of water supply and demand? Yeah.
So I think of course, we will always be data limited, but in a lot of ways, I would say wetlands provide a lot of functions. I mean, even if you don't have data, you can assume that they're going to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So that's part of what I would say. So I think part of it in terms of the space of helping, I think preventing loss of wetlands is one of the big pieces of the story. In terms of where research should focus on, if that's the question, I think there's multiple venues where we need more, right? So it could be like studying set of wetlands, doing data collection, understanding how much nitrogen and phosphorus is removed, how much greenhouse gas emissions happen, all of these variables. Like I said, if you looked at my wetland map, I have like, I think 2 data points from India and few from China. So with this student from China, we actually have populated China with hundreds of data sets, and these were there in the Chinese language literature that I wasn't able to access, right? So I think it's important to have more data, because then our models will be more robust. It's really not very good idea to take a model that's developed primarily from North America data and apply it to tropical landscapes, right? So I think data is definitely needed, but also the right data and data from multiple wetlands, and then thinking about, but at the other end of the spectrum, there is also value in thinking about taking what data exists and putting it into modeling frameworks to ask the question, how much do existing wetlands across India remove nitrogen? And of course, because without data, you would be limited to an extent, but you'd get a first order estimate, which can help argue for the case of
Yes.
wetlands.
Yes. Sure. So I have one more question. Like, it's just because I have done my master's in water quality, and one of the case study which I have taken is the urban Chennai region in urban. So where I have studied about the heavy metal contamination from the industrial area and how it impacts the residential areas. So, like for example, so I have done the survey and tried to see what are the different heavy metals that we get. So in one of the I have studied like whole of the Chennai metropolitan area, and I found the heavy metal was very high in that particular groundwater samples. So I wanted to discuss about what are the different policy implications which you can suggest, like for urban region, like how from where to start and how you can provide us solutions to, because people have been using groundwater a lot in these areas, because that is the main source of supply for them with respect other than the metro supplies. So what kind of start that we can think about in the Chennai regions, like for example? Yeah. So
just to interrupt you, sorry for interruption. Let us take the question from Anandamoy also, because he has also raised his hand. And since this question is relevant to heavy metals, not directly what she spoke about, we can take that later. So let
sure.
Anandamoy also ask his question.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe you can answer both of them together, Professor Basu.
Sure.
Meanwhile,
am I
I just
audible?
want to, yeah. Meanwhile, I just want to say, I just want to request all attendees to switch on their videos. Our team will quickly take a photo while Dr. Basu responds to Anandamoy.
And please let the little one be at the back. We want him to be in the photo also.
Yeah, you see, it's already entered my space right now.
Yeah.
You want to come? Okay, he doesn't want to come.
Yeah. No. Please go ahead, Anandamoy.
Am I audible to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Madam, how have you captured the data of nitrogen and phosphate? Nitrogen and phosphate. Is it an on-site capturing or off-site capturing data of data?
So when you say data of nitrogen and phosphate, are you talking about the stream data or which part of the work? So I presented a lot of stream data.
For example, stream data.
Stream data, right? So I
Yes.
presented stream data. Stream data is basically measured in the stream. So most of the data that exists is grab samples. So people go take samples and measure them in the lab, and then that data is available, and then we process that. I don't collect that data. So both in US and Canada, there are agencies that collect the data, and I use that data.
So the sample is collected and later on it analyzed in the laboratory, something like that.
Most of it, yes. There is
something
some
like that.
inline sensors, but most of the data is analyzed later in the lab. Yeah.
And
so there is some on-site detection system is also there.
Say that.
On-site collection of data.
Nitrogen and phosphorus,
On-site collection of data is also there.
there are some inline sensors for nitrogen and phosphorus, but they are really expensive, so there's not a huge amount that that could be done. So most of it is grab sample data. It's really expensive to have like a continuous sensor, so it is a lot of grab sample data.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, if you would
So,
like to continue.
maybe I'll ask. I'll respond to Mayank's question
Yes.
too quickly. So the
Yes.
quick response, Mayank, though I don't work on heavy metals, for any problem, I say break it down into sources and pathways. So I would say, my question would be, what are the main sources of heavy metals? And that's kind of your clue to say, what are the policy structures that you need? Like if it's industry, regulating those industry, and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more raised hands. Professor Shubhimal, do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, I mean, thank you so much, Professor Basu, for such a wonderful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was so nice, though it is not really directly related to my area, but it was it was wonderful. Thank you so much for agreeing, and you can see a lot of students are actually interacting, which is, I mean, which you normally don't see, which is really nice. I mean, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk.
So much for the invite. Really appreciate it.
And please visit our IDP Climate Studies IIT Bombay during your next visit.
We'll definitely do. We'll definitely do. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone else for joining. Do watch out for the next webinar. We'll announce it when the date and all is decided. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have
Take
a
care.
good evening. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Did you get